Picture this. You're walking through a vast library that contains every book ever written about human history. Thousands of volumes line the shelves, chronicling our journey from ancient civilizations to modern times. But as you move deeper into this library, you notice something unsettling. Entire sections are missing. Not just a few books here and there, but massive gaps where centuries of human experience should be documented. These aren't books that were lost to fire or flood. These are periods of time that seem to have been completely erased from the historical record, as if humanity itself simply vanished for hundreds or even thousands of years. What if I told you that these gaps aren't just metaphorical? What if there really are missing centuries in human history, periods where archaeological evidence disappears, where civilizations seem to have simply stopped existing, and where the story of our species contains blank pages that we still cannot explain? This isn't science fiction. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is one of the most perplexing mysteries in all of archaeology and anthropology. If you're listening to this to help you fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I create these explorations into history's deepest mysteries. So maybe hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the global community that gathers here each night, from Tokyo at sunrise to London at midnight, all united by our fascination with the unknown chapters of human experience. Tonight, we're going to journey into what historians call the missing age, a phenomenon that has puzzled researchers for generations. We're talking about gaps in the archaeological record so profound that they challenge everything we think we know about the continuous march of human civilization. These aren't minor inconsistencies or dating errors. These are vast chasms in time where entire populations seem to have vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions and the faintest traces of their existence. The story begins in the most unexpected places. Archaeological digs that should reveal layer upon layer of human habitation instead show sudden stops in the stratigraphic record. Cities that thrived for centuries simply end, with no evidence of conquest, disease, or natural disaster. Trade routes that connected distant civilizations abruptly cease, as if the merchants and travellers who used them for generations simply decided to stop existing. Population centres that supported thousands of people show signs of gradual abandonment, but not in the way you'd expect from economic decline or environmental pressure. What makes these gaps so mysterious is their global nature. This isn't happening in just one region or to just one culture. From Europe to Asia, from the Americas to Africa, researchers have identified periods where human activity seems to dramatically decrease or disappear entirely from the archaeological record. The timing varies by location, but the pattern remains eerily consistent. Thriving societies reach a certain level of development, maintain that level for generations, and then suddenly fade from history with minimal explanation. Consider the Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. This event saw the simultaneous decline or destruction of several major civilizations around the Eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and numerous city-states throughout the region all experienced catastrophic decline within a relatively short period. But here's what makes it truly puzzling. While we can identify that these civilizations fell, the archaeological record for what happened immediately afterward becomes remarkably thin. For centuries following this collapse, the material culture becomes dramatically simplified. Writing systems disappear. Monumental architecture stops being built. Trade networks that had connected distant regions for hundreds of years simply vanish. Population levels plummet. It's as if the accumulated knowledge and social complexity of these civilizations was somehow lost, forcing survivors to essentially start over from a much more basic level of development. But the Late Bronze Age collapse is just one example of this phenomenon. Similar gaps appear throughout human history, some lasting decades, others spanning centuries. The European Dark Ages, despite the name being somewhat disputed by modern historians, represent another period where documentation becomes sparse and archaeological evidence suggests significant population decline and cultural simplification. The classic Maya collapse around 900 CE saw major population centers in Central America abandoned, with sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge seemingly vanishing overnight. What's particularly fascinating about these missing periods is not just what disappeared, but how quickly civilizations seem to recover. When the archaeological record resumes, it often shows rapid development of new technologies, social systems, and cultural practices. It's as if humanity possessed some kind of collective memory that allowed for remarkably quick reconstruction of complex societies after periods of apparent regression. This pattern raises profound questions about the nature of human civilization itself. Are we looking at natural cycles of rise and decline that are inherent to complex societies? Could environmental factors we don't fully understand be responsible for these periodic collapses? Or is there something more mysterious at work, something that challenges our basic assumptions about how human societies develop and maintain themselves over time? The mystery deepens when we examine the quality of evidence that does survive from these transitional periods. Often, the artifacts and structures that remain from just before these gaps show levels of sophistication that seem inconsistent with what follows. Ancient sites display engineering capabilities that required advanced mathematical understanding and organizational skills. Astronomical alignments in megalithic structures demonstrate knowledge of celestial mechanics that supposedly wasn't rediscovered for centuries. Then there are the oral traditions and mythological accounts from cultures around the world that speak of great catastrophes, lost golden ages, and periods of darkness when knowledge was hidden or lost. These stories, dismissed for generations as mere folklore, show remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other. They describe similar patterns of destruction and renewal, of knowledge keepers who preserved wisdom through dark times, and of civilizations that rose to great heights before falling into obscurity. Modern dating techniques have only added to the mystery. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and other scientific methods have revealed inconsistencies in the traditional timeline of human development. Sites that should show continuous occupation instead display clear breaks in habitation. Artifacts appear in geological layers where they shouldn't exist according to conventional chronology. Cultural developments that should have taken centuries to evolve appear suddenly in the archaeological record with no apparent precursors. Perhaps most intriguingly, genetic studies of modern human populations reveal bottlenecks and migration patterns that don't align neatly with the accepted historical narrative. DNA evidence suggests periods of dramatic population reduction, followed by rapid expansion. But these genetic signals often don't correspond with known historical events or environmental catastrophes. The implications of these missing ages extend far beyond academic curiosity. If there really are significant gaps in human history, if civilizations have repeatedly risen and fallen in ways we don't understand, then our conception of human progress as a steady, linear advancement needs to be reconsidered. Perhaps human development is more cyclical than we've assumed, with periods of advancement followed by retreat and renewal. This possibility forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own civilization's stability and permanence. If advanced societies have disappeared before, leaving only fragmentary evidence of their existence, what does that say about our own future? Are we living through just another cycle in an ancient pattern of rise and fall? As we delve deeper into this mystery, we'll explore specific examples of these missing periods, examine the evidence that has led researchers to question the conventional timeline, and consider the various theories that attempt to explain these gaps in human history. We'll look at archaeological sites that seem to defy explanation, genetic evidence that suggests hidden chapters in our past, and the disturbing possibility that entire civilizations may have been deliberately erased from the historical record. The journey ahead will take us to forgotten ruins, lost cities, and abandoned settlements where the silence of centuries echoes with unanswered questions. We'll examine the phenomenon of collective amnesia that seems to grip entire populations, causing them to forget not just historical events, but the very technologies and knowledge systems that sustained their ancestors. And we'll investigate why modern institutions might have reasons to keep these missing chapters hidden from public view. The first clue that something fundamental is wrong with our understanding of human history comes from a simple observation that archaeologists rarely discuss openly. When you examine sites of ancient habitation across the globe, the layering of human occupation should tell a clear story. Each generation builds upon the last, leaving behind traces of their daily lives, their technologies, their social organization. Over centuries and millennia, these layers accumulate like pages in a book, with each stratum representing a chapter in the ongoing story of human development. But that's not what we find. Instead, at sites around the world, researchers encounter something that shouldn't exist according to conventional models of human progress. They find layers of sophisticated material culture, evidence of advanced metallurgy, complex architectural techniques, and intricate artistic traditions. Then, abruptly, these layers end. Above them lies evidence of much simpler societies, sometimes separated by sterile layers of soil that suggest abandonment lasting decades or centuries. This pattern appears so consistently across different continents and time periods that it can't be explained by isolated catastrophes or cultural anomalies. We're looking at a global phenomenon that suggests human civilization has repeatedly achieved levels of sophistication, only to somehow lose that knowledge and start again from a much more primitive baseline. Take the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, between approximately 3,300 and 1,300 BCE. At its height, this civilization demonstrated urban planning that wouldn't be matched again for millennia. Their cities featured sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and evidence of long-distance trade networks. The quality of their craftsmanship in bronze working, seal carving, and pottery was extraordinarily high. Then, around 1900 BCE, this entire civilization began to decline. But decline isn't quite the right word because decline implies a gradual process. What happened to the Indus Valley civilization was more like a fade. Over the course of a few centuries, their cities were gradually abandoned, their trade networks collapsed, and their distinctive material culture disappeared. By 1300 BCE, the civilization had effectively vanished, leaving behind only ruins and a script that remains undeciphered to this day. What makes this disappearance so puzzling is that there's no evidence of conquest, natural disaster, or environmental catastrophe severe enough to explain the collapse. The cities weren't destroyed by armies or buried by floods. They were simply abandoned, as if the people who had built and maintained them for over 1,000 years suddenly decided to walk away and never return. Similar patterns emerge when we examine other ancient civilizations. The Mycenaean Greeks, who built the palaces described in Homer's epics, vanished around 1200 BCE, leaving behind only scattered populations who seem to have forgotten how to write, how to build in stone, and how to maintain the complex social structures their ancestors had created. The sophisticated artistic and architectural traditions of the Maya seem to evaporate around 900 CE, with major cities abandoned and knowledge systems that had tracked celestial movements with extraordinary precision simply lost. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these missing ages is not what was lost, but how completely it was forgotten. When these civilizations disappeared, they didn't just lose their political structures or their economic systems, they lost their cultural memory. Later populations living in the same regions had no recollection of the advanced societies that had preceded them. It's as if entire chapters of human experience had been erased not just from the archaeological record, but from collective memory itself. This phenomenon of cultural amnesia appears throughout history with unsettling regularity. The builders of Europe's megalithic monuments, structures that required advanced understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering, vanished so completely that later populations attributed these constructions to giants or gods. The sophisticated hydraulic engineering systems of ancient Peru, which managed water resources across vast mountainous regions, fell into disuse and were forgotten so thoroughly that Spanish colonizers had no idea they were walking over the remnants of one of history's most advanced irrigation networks. Even more recently, we can observe this pattern in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. While Rome's fall is well documented historically, what followed demonstrates the same mysterious process of knowledge loss that characterizes earlier missing ages. Within a few generations of the empire's collapse, European populations had forgotten how to manufacture concrete, how to build roads that would last for centuries, how to construct aqueducts, and how to maintain the complex administrative systems that had governed millions of people. The speed of this forgetting is what makes it so difficult to explain through conventional historical models. Technological knowledge doesn't simply vanish overnight. Craft traditions are passed from master to apprentice across generations. Social institutions develop momentum that should carry them through temporary disruptions. Yet repeatedly throughout history, we see evidence of sophisticated societies whose accumulated wisdom disappears as if it had never existed. Modern archaeologists have developed various theories to explain these gaps. Climate change, they suggest, could have disrupted agricultural systems and forced populations to abandon their settlements. Disease outbreaks might have decimated populations so severely that cultural continuity was broken. Economic collapse could have made it impossible to maintain complex social structures. But none of these explanations adequately address the scale and consistency of the phenomenon. Climate changes that might affect one region shouldn't simultaneously impact civilizations on different continents. Disease outbreaks, however severe, typically leave survivors who retain at least some cultural knowledge. Economic collapses usually result in simplification rather than complete cultural amnesia. What we're observing appears to be something more systematic, more comprehensive than any of these conventional explanations can account for. It's almost as if human civilization operates according to cycles we don't understand, with periods of advancement inevitably followed by periods of retreat and forgetting. The implications of this cyclical pattern extend far beyond academic history. If human societies have repeatedly achieved high levels of development only to lose that knowledge and start again, then our current technological civilization might not be as unprecedented as we assume. We might be living through just the latest iteration of a pattern that has repeated itself throughout human history. This possibility becomes even more unsettling when we consider the mechanisms by which knowledge might be systematically lost. In our own era, we've witnessed how quickly information can disappear when the systems that preserve it break down. Digital storage systems that seem permanent can become inaccessible within decades as technology evolves. Physical libraries can be destroyed by war or natural disaster. But the kind of comprehensive knowledge loss we see in the missing ages suggests something more deliberate, more organized than simple technological failure or random catastrophe. As we continue our exploration into these lost chapters of human history, we'll examine the possibility that these missing ages weren't just accidents of history, but the result of conscious efforts to erase certain periods from human memory. We'll investigate the evidence for advanced technologies that existed in the distant past, and we'll consider why modern institutions might have compelling reasons to keep these discoveries hidden from public view. The story we're uncovering challenges everything we've been taught about the progression of human civilization, and it raises profound questions about what other secrets might be buried beneath the official narrative of our past. Something else emerges when we start looking closely at the physical evidence from these missing periods. The artifacts that do survive often display characteristics that don't fit neatly into our understanding of technological development. Metal objects with purities that shouldn't have been achievable with supposedly primitive smelting techniques. Stone carvings that show tool marks inconsistent with the bronze or iron implements that were supposedly available at the time. Architectural elements that require mathematical knowledge supposedly unknown to the cultures credited with their creation. But here's where things get really strange. When these anomalous artifacts are discovered, they often seem to disappear from academic discourse with remarkable speed. Museums acquire them, catalogue them briefly, then move them to storage where they're rarely displayed or studied. Research papers describing unusual finds get published in obscure journals and then fade from citation. Doctoral students who choose to focus on these anomalies often find their funding mysteriously cut, or their academic advisors suddenly reluctant to support their work. This pattern of institutional amnesia mirrors the cultural amnesia we see in the historical record itself. Just as ancient civilizations seem to forget their own achievements, modern academia appears to have developed mechanisms for forgetting discoveries that don't fit established narratives. The result is a sanitized version of human history that emphasizes steady, linear progress, while quietly ignoring evidence that suggests a more complex and mysterious past. The dating inconsistencies become even more pronounced when we apply multiple independent methods to the same sites. Radiocarbon dating might suggest one age for organic materials, while thermoluminescence dating of pottery from the same layer suggests a completely different time frame. Geological dating of the rock strata might point to yet another age entirely. Rather than acknowledging these inconsistencies as evidence that our understanding might be incomplete, researchers often simply choose the dates that best fit their expectations and ignore the conflicting evidence. This selective interpretation of data extends to the treatment of oral traditions from indigenous cultures around the world. Many of these traditions contain detailed accounts of previous civilizations that achieved great heights before falling into decline. They describe technologies and capabilities that seem fantastical to modern ears, but which show remarkable consistency across cultures that had no contact with each other. Instead of considering the possibility that these traditions might preserve genuine historical memories, academic institutions typically dismiss them as mythology or folklore. The result is a feedback loop that reinforces the official narrative while systematically excluding any evidence that might challenge it. Students learn a simplified version of human development that presents technological progress as a straight line from primitive to advanced. Researchers who might question this narrative find their careers stalled or their funding eliminated. Institutions develop protocols that effectively filter out discoveries that don't conform to accepted timelines, but the evidence keeps accumulating despite these institutional barriers. Independent researchers, often working outside traditional academic structures, continue to uncover artifacts and sites that suggest human history is far more complex than we've been taught. They document archaeological anomalies that mainstream institutions prefer to ignore. They preserve oral traditions that contain information about lost civilizations. They develop new dating techniques that reveal inconsistencies in established chronologies. What emerges from this alternative research is a picture of human development that looks nothing like the smooth progression we see in textbooks. Instead, it resembles something more like a spiral, with civilizations repeatedly rising to great heights, achieving remarkable sophistication, then experiencing catastrophic decline that erases most evidence of their achievements. The survivors of these collapses retain fragments of knowledge, which they use to rebuild, but the process of reconstruction often takes centuries or millennia, and much of the original knowledge is permanently lost. This cyclical pattern helps explain some of the most puzzling aspects of ancient sites around the world. The megalithic structures found on every continent often display a level of engineering sophistication that seems inconsistent with the simple tools supposedly available to their builders. The astronomical alignments built into these monuments demonstrate knowledge of celestial mechanics that wasn't supposed to exist until much later periods. The transportation and placement of massive stone blocks suggests organizational capabilities and possibly technologies that don't appear in the conventional historical record. Rather than acknowledging that earlier civilizations might have possessed advanced capabilities, mainstream archaeology has developed increasingly elaborate theories to explain these achievements using only primitive technologies. They propose that massive stones were moved using log rollers, rope, and human muscle power. They suggest that precise astronomical alignments were achieved through generations of careful observation using only naked eye astronomy. They argue that complex mathematical relationships found in ancient structures were coincidental rather than intentional. But these explanations become increasingly strained as new discoveries continue to challenge their underlying assumptions. Ground-penetrating radar reveals that many ancient sites extend far deeper underground than previously suspected, suggesting construction projects of enormous scale and sophistication. Microscopic analysis of stone surfaces shows tool marks that don't match any known ancient implements. Chemical analysis of metal artifacts reveals alloy compositions that shouldn't have been possible with supposedly primitive metallurgy. The accumulation of this contradictory evidence creates what scientists call paradigm stress, the point at which an established theoretical framework begins to buckle under the weight of observations it cannot adequately explain. In healthy scientific disciplines, this stress eventually leads to paradigm shifts, fundamental changes in how researchers understand their subject matter. But in archaeology and anthropology, institutional structures seem designed to prevent such shifts from occurring. The careers of researchers depend on their ability to secure funding from institutions that are heavily invested in maintaining current paradigms. Academic journals, controlled by editorial boards committed to established theories, reject papers that challenge fundamental assumptions about human development. Museums, dependent on public support and government funding, avoid displays that might raise uncomfortable questions about the completeness of our knowledge. This institutional resistance to paradigm change means that discoveries which should revolutionize our understanding of human history instead disappear into storage rooms and archives where they're effectively removed from scientific discourse. the public continues to receive a simplified narrative of human progress that bears little resemblance to the complex and mysterious reality suggested by the physical evidence. The psychological impact of this systematic concealment extends far beyond academic circles. If people understood that human civilization has repeatedly achieved great heights before experiencing catastrophic decline, it might fundamentally change how we view our own society's apparent stability and permanence. The confidence that underlies modern technological civilization depends partly on the belief that we represent the pinnacle of human achievement, that our ancestors were primitive compared to our current capabilities. The revelation that previous civilizations might have achieved levels of sophistication equal to or greater than our own would shatter this comfortable assumption. It would force us to confront the possibility that our own civilization might be vulnerable to the same forces that apparently destroyed earlier societies. It would raise disturbing questions about whether the knowledge and capabilities we consider permanent achievements might actually be temporary acquisitions that could be lost as completely as they apparently were in the past. This psychological dimension helps explain why evidence of missing ages might be actively suppressed rather than simply ignored. The implications of acknowledging these gaps in human history extend far beyond academic theory into fundamental questions about the nature of civilization itself. If human societies operate according to cycles of rise and decline, if advanced knowledge can be lost so completely that later generations have no memory of their ancestors' achievements, then our entire conception of progress and permanence needs to be reconsidered. The next phase of our investigation takes us deeper into the specific mechanisms by which civilizations might lose their accumulated knowledge, and why certain institutions might have compelling reasons to prevent this information from reaching public awareness. The mechanisms by which entire civilizations can lose their accumulated knowledge are far more fragile than most people realize. We tend to think of human knowledge as cumulative, building steadily over generations like layers of sediment. But this assumption ignores a fundamental truth about how information is actually preserved and transmitted across time. Knowledge exists in three forms. It lives in individual minds, it's embedded in social institutions, and it's encoded in physical artifacts. When all three of these preservation systems fail simultaneously, entire bodies of knowledge can vanish as completely as if they had never existed. Consider how quickly modern societies can lose access to their own recent technologies. Digital storage formats that were cutting edge 20 years ago are now completely obsolete. Software that required years of development becomes unusable when the hardware it was designed for is no longer manufactured. Programming languages that powered entire industries fade into obscurity when newer systems replace them. This technological obsolescence happens within single lifetimes, yet we assume that ancient civilizations would have been more successful at preserving their knowledge across centuries or millennia. The vulnerability of knowledge becomes even more apparent when we examine how it's transmitted between generations. Master craftsmen who spend decades perfecting their skills often struggle to find apprentices willing to invest the time needed to learn traditional techniques. When economic conditions change, when new technologies emerge, when social priorities shift, these transmission chains can break completely. Within a single generation, knowledge that took centuries to develop can simply disappear because no one considered it worth preserving. This process explains how ancient civilizations could have possessed sophisticated technologies that left no trace in the archaeological record. If knowledge was transmitted primarily through oral tradition and hands-on training, if the practitioners formed small specialized groups, if the techniques required materials or conditions that became unavailable, then entire technological traditions could vanish without leaving any physical evidence of their existence. But the loss of knowledge is only part of the puzzle. What makes the missing ages truly mysterious is the apparent loss of memory itself. It's one thing for a civilization to forget how to perform certain techniques or maintain certain technologies. It's quite another for them to completely forget that these capabilities ever existed. Yet this is exactly what we see repeatedly throughout history. Later populations don't just lack the skills of their predecessors, they seem to have no awareness that such skills ever existed. This systematic amnesia suggests something more than simple knowledge loss. It implies active forgetting, a process by which inconvenient or dangerous memories are deliberately removed from cultural transmission. Social groups have many mechanisms for managing collective memory. They choose which stories to tell and which to suppress. They decide which traditions to maintain and which to abandon. They determine what gets recorded in permanent form and what remains purely oral. When civilizations experience traumatic collapses, these memory management systems can work in reverse. Instead of preserving important knowledge for future generations, they might actively suppress memories of the previous era. Survivors might associate the lost civilization with whatever catastrophe destroyed it, creating psychological pressure to forget rather than remember. New political or religious systems might deliberately erase evidence of previous achievements to legitimize their own authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that this kind of deliberate forgetting has occurred repeatedly throughout history. Sites that should contain continuous occupation records instead show clear breaks, where entire cultural layers have been deliberately removed or covered over. Inscriptions that would have preserved historical information show signs of systematic defacement. Artifacts that would have linked later civilizations to their predecessors are found buried in context that suggest intentional concealment rather than accidental loss. The pattern becomes even more pronounced when we examine how modern institutions handle discoveries that challenge conventional chronologies. When artifacts are found that don't fit established timelines, they often disappear into private collections or institutional storage facilities where they're effectively removed from scientific study. When sites are discovered that suggest more advanced ancient technologies, access is frequently restricted through legal or bureaucratic mechanisms that prevent independent verification of the findings. This contemporary suppression of evidence mirrors the historical pattern of deliberate forgetting. Just as ancient civilizations might have had reasons to erase memories of their predecessors, modern institutions might have compelling motivations to prevent certain discoveries from reaching public awareness. The stability of existing academic, political, and economic structures depends partly on maintaining accepted narratives about human development. Evidence that challenges these narratives represents a potential threat to established authority systems. The financial implications alone are staggering. Billions of dollars in research funding, museum investments, and educational infrastructure are built around current theories of human development. Academic careers spanning decades rest on interpretations of evidence that might need to be completely revised if the true complexity of human history were acknowledged. Publishing industries, documentary producers, and educational institutions have massive investments in materials based on conventional chronologies, but the implications extend far beyond financial considerations. If human civilization has repeatedly achieved high levels of development only to experience catastrophic collapse, it challenges fundamental assumptions about progress, stability, and the permanence of modern achievements. This revelation might trigger social and psychological responses that institutions consider dangerous to public order. Consider how differently people might behave if they understood that technological civilization has repeatedly collapsed in the past. Would they continue to assume that current economic systems are permanent and stable? Would they maintain confidence in long-term planning and investment strategies? Would they accept the authority of institutions that had concealed this crucial information about human history? The social disruption caused by such revelations might be considered unacceptable by those responsible for maintaining current systems. This perspective helps explain why evidence of missing ages might be systematically suppressed through coordinated institutional action. If multiple organizations share interests in maintaining existing narratives, they might develop formal or informal protocols for managing discoveries that threaten those narratives. Academic journals might establish editorial policies that discourage publication of certain types of research. Museums might develop acquisition and display practices that minimize public exposure to problematic artifacts. Government agencies might classify information or restrict access to sites that contain challenging evidence. The sophistication of these suppression mechanisms suggests that they've been developed over considerable time periods. The consistency of the response across different institutions and national boundaries implies coordination at levels that extend beyond individual organizations or governments. This raises the possibility that knowledge of human history's true complexity has been maintained by groups that operate outside normal academic and governmental structures. So here we are, standing at the edge of what might be the greatest mystery in human history. The missing ages aren't just gaps in our knowledge, they're windows into a past far more complex and cyclical than we've ever been taught. From the vanished Indus Valley cities to the systematic suppression of anomalous artifacts, from the inexplicable forgetting that follows each collapse to the institutional resistance that greets every challenge to accepted timelines, we've seen how entire chapters of human experience can be erased so completely that even their memory disappears. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that we might be living through just another iteration of this ancient pattern. Our technological civilization, which we assume represents the pinnacle of human achievement, might actually be the latest in a long series of rises and falls that stretch back far deeper into time than we've ever imagined. The evidence suggests that human societies have repeatedly climbed to great heights, only to experience catastrophic collapses that reset the entire trajectory of development. If this cyclical view of history is correct, then our current age isn't the beginning of human progress, but merely its most recent chapter. The knowledge we consider cutting edge might be rediscoveries of capabilities that existed in previous eras. The technologies we think are unprecedented might be echoes of achievements that were lost when earlier civilizations fell into the darkness of missing ages. The gaps in human history remain, stubbornly resistant to conventional explanation. They whisper of advanced societies that rose and fell before recorded history began. They hint at technologies and knowledge systems that disappeared so completely that later generations couldn't even imagine they had ever existed. They suggest that human memory itself might be far more fragile than we assume, capable of forgetting entire eras of achievement within just a few generations. Whether these missing ages represent natural cycles of development and decline, or whether they're the result of more deliberate processes of suppression and forgetting, their existence challenges everything we think we know about the stability and permanence of civilization. They force us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that our own achievements might be just as temporary, just as vulnerable to loss as those of our forgotten predecessors. The mystery of the missing ages remains unsolved, hidden in the spaces between what we know and what we've forgotten. And perhaps that's exactly how certain forces want it to remain. Because sometimes the most dangerous knowledge is the knowledge that we've been here before, achieved great things before, and lost it all before. Sometimes the most threatening truth is that history doesn't move in a straight line toward progress, but turns in cycles that we're only just beginning to understand. And yet, even after all of that, even after you let the idea settle into your mind, the idea that history might be a loop, a spiral, a cycle that rises and collapses and rises again, there's still a deeper question hiding beneath the surface. And yet, even after you let that idea settle in your mind, the idea that history might be a loop, a spiral, a cycle that rises and collapses and rises again, there's still a deeper question hiding beneath the surface. Because the missing age isn't just about cities that emptied out, or scripts that went silent, or trade routes that stopped. It's about what happens to human beings when the scaffolding of complexity disappears, what survives when the institutions vanish, what fragments of knowledge remain when the specialists are gone, and how you can tell the difference between a true blank page and a page written in a kind of ink that doesn't last. This is where archaeology stops being romantic and becomes almost forensic. Because when archaeologists talk about gaps, they're often talking about stratigraphy, layers in the ground that should show continuous human activity. They expect a thick, messy accumulation. Charcoal from fires, broken pottery, butchered bones, collapsed mud brick, debris from daily life. And in many places they do find exactly that, until the moment they don't, until they hit a sterile horizon. A band of clean sediment with almost no human material. No pottery sherds, no food remains, no hearths, no construction debris. Sometimes that sterile horizon is thin, sometimes it's thick. Sometimes it's clearly flood silt laid down quickly. The kind of deposit that can bury an entire occupation surface in a single season. Other times it's wind-blown dust accumulating slowly over decades. The kind of quiet deposition that only happens when no one is there to disturb the ground. And that distinction matters, because a flood deposit tells a different story than a wind-blown dust layer. Flood silt means the environment changed abruptly. It can wipe out agriculture, destroy infrastructure, contaminate water sources, and force people to relocate. Wind-blown dust, on the other hand, often indicates longer-term abandonment or landscape degradation. Fields turning to bare soil, vegetation thinning, the kind of slow collapse that leaves an area exposed to constant erosion. So the first step in understanding a missing age is brutally simple. What is the sterile layer made of? Is it river silt, desert sand, volcanic ash, colluvial slope wash, a stable soil horizon, suggesting a long pause where plants grew undisturbed? Because once you know the sediment, you're no longer talking about mystery in the abstract. You're talking about physical processes that leave signatures you can test. Volcanic ash is especially revealing. Ash layers can be chemically fingerprinted to specific eruptions. If an ash horizon appears across multiple sites, you can synchronize timelines with startling accuracy. And when you start doing that, you sometimes find eerie alignments, collapses that cluster around periods of volcanic activity, global cooling, drought, or sudden shifts in rainfall patterns. This is one of the reasons the Late Bronze Age collapse remains so compelling. It may not have been one cause. It may have been a cascading failure, a system collapse triggered by multiple stresses at once: drought, famine, internal conflict, external migration, the breakdown of trade networks that supplied crucial metals like tin. But the point is that it looks like a system failing, not a single city being conquered, and system failures create gaps. Because when the system that produces writing, monumental building, long-distance trade, and dense urban life collapses, what replaces it is often smaller, more local, and less visible archaeologically. A village leaves fewer durable traces than a palace. A pot made for household use leaves fewer diagnostic markers than elite ceremonial wares. An economy based on subsistence leaves less imported material than an economy based on international exchange. So a missing age can emerge simply because complexity collapses into forms that don't fossilize well. But then, the question becomes, if people didn't disappear entirely, where did they go? And that question has a surprisingly concrete answer in many cases: up and out, up into hills, out into marginal landscapes, into places that are harder to excavate, harder to survey, harder to even notice unless you're looking for them. After collapses, populations often move away from lowland urban centres and into defensible terrain. They settle in upland villages, smaller communities, scattered farmsteads. From the perspective of later historians, the civilization vanished, but from the perspective of human survival, it simply reorganized. This is one of the reasons the word Dark Age can be misleading. Darkness implies nothing happened, but often what it really means is that the kinds of things that leave bright archaeological signals, writing, monumental architecture, elite art, were reduced, while everyday life continued in quieter forms. And sometimes those quieter forms are hard to see until new methods appear. This is where technologies like LiDAR change the story. LiDAR can strip away forest canopy digitally, revealing earthworks, terraces, roads, and urban layouts invisible from the ground. In regions like Mesoamerica, LiDAR surveys have revealed enormous networks of settlements and infrastructure that were simply not visible before. Roads, causeways, terracing, fortifications, dense habitation zones. And once you see those networks, the idea of sudden disappearance becomes harder to maintain. It begins to look more like redistribution. A city centre might be abandoned, yes, but the population might not be gone. It might be dispersed across the landscape, living in a pattern that doesn't match our expectation of civilization. So the missing age can be an artifact of visibility. But there are still cases where disappearance seems more severe, where not only cities empty, but writing stops, specialized crafts vanish, and the technological repertoire shrinks dramatically. The best way to understand that is to think about how fragile specialization really is. Complex societies run on specialists. You need scribes to maintain records. You need trained masons to cut stone precisely. You need metallurgists to produce consistent alloys. You need administrators to coordinate labor and taxation. You need merchants to maintain trade routes. You need shipbuilders, engineers, priests, teachers, accountants. People whose skills are not easily replaced by generalists. If a collapse kills or disperses those specialists, the skill chain breaks. And when the skill chain breaks, you don't just lose products, you lose the ability to reproduce the knowledge. This is why the loss of writing is such a powerful marker. Writing isn't just a tool, it's an institutional technology. It requires trained scribes, materials, schools, social demand. If the institutions that support it collapse, writing can vanish quickly, not because humans forget language, but because the social machine that produces literacy disappears. And when writing disappears, the speed of cultural forgetting accelerates, because now memory has to be carried in oral form alone, and oral transmission, while powerful, has different properties. It preserves stories, meanings, and identities remarkably well, but it can lose technical specifics over time, especially if those specifics are no longer immediately useful. So a civilization might survive biologically. People continue living, marrying, raising children, while collapsing culturally in a very specific way. The loss of high-level technical institutions. That's what simplification, in the archaeological record often represents. Not a species regressing, but a system shedding complexity because complexity became too expensive to maintain. Now, if you want to make this even more concrete, you can watch it happen in a single material: pottery. Pottery is one of archaeology's favourite timekeepers because it changes in style and technique, and it survives. In stable, complex societies, pottery often becomes standardized. You see consistent forms, consistent firing temperatures, consistent decoration patterns. You can track trade because certain fabrics and styles move across regions. During collapses, pottery often becomes more local, more variable, sometimes lower fired, sometimes with simpler decoration. Not because people became dumber, but because centralized production and distribution systems broke down. Workshops lost supply chains, specialists lost patrons. People made what they could with what they had. So in a collapse, the pottery record becomes a kind of heartbeat monitor. You can see complexity rise, plateau, then drop. And when it drops, you often see the same pattern in other materials. Metallurgy becomes less consistent, architecture becomes smaller, imported goods become rare. This is the material signature of a missing age. But here's where the mystery returns, because there are moments when that signature appears without a clear external trigger. No obvious invasion, no massive burn layer, no clear epidemic cemetery, no single catastrophic event. Instead, slow abandonment, then silence, then a new pattern. This is where researchers start to look at soft causes, things like political legitimacy, social cohesion, internal conflict, and the hidden vulnerabilities that build up inside systems. Because civilizations can collapse from within, a long drought doesn't have to kill everyone directly. It can undermine the state's ability to distribute food, leading to rebellion, fragmentation, elite conflict. A trade disruption doesn't have to starve a city. It can break the economic logic that kept the elite structure stable. A series of smaller stresses can push a system past a threshold, and once it crosses, collapse can be rapid. And thresholds are important, because complex systems often look stable until they don't. They can absorb shock after shock, giving the illusion of resilience, until one more shock hits and the entire structure flips into a new state. This is why collapses can look sudden in the archaeological record, even if the pressure's built for decades. And after the flip, what comes next is often a reorganization phase that doesn't resemble the old system. That reorganization phase is often what we perceive as missing. Now take that idea and apply it to the Maya collapse. The Maya didn't vanish as a people. The Maya still exist today, but many major classic period cities were abandoned, monumental buildings slowed or stopped, and certain elite institutions collapsed. There is evidence for drought, environmental stress, warfare, political fragmentation, multiple causes interacting. And here's the important part. In many cases, you can see signs of rising conflict before the collapse. Fortifications, defensive walls, trauma in skeletons, burned structures. It's not pure mystery. Yet the scale and pattern of abandonment still feels dramatic because it's tied to a collapse of elite urban systems. And when the elite system collapses, the record changes shape. The same with Mycenaean Greece. After the palatial centres collapse, you see a reduction in long-distance trade, the loss of linear bee writing, simpler material culture. But you also see continuity in some regions, survival of certain traditions, and eventually re-emergence in new forms. So again, not pure disappearance, transformation. And transformation can look like absence if you're only trained to recognize one form of complexity. Now, with Indus, the mystery becomes sharper because the collapse looks less violent. Cities seem to be abandoned in stages. There are theories about river changes, shifting monsoon patterns, trade decline, social reorganization. The undeciphered script makes it harder because writing would have been the strongest internal record of what happened. Without it, we're forced to interpret from the material alone. This is where missing ages become psychologically powerful. They're not just gaps in data, they're gaps in narrative. Because humans want stories. We want cause and effect. We want villains or disasters or clear turning points. But archaeology often gives you something colder, a pattern of debris and silence, and you have to build a story from that, carefully, without forcing it. So the real tension in this mystery comes from two opposing truths. First, many missing ages can be explained through known processes: climate stress, system fragility, collapse of institutions, population redistribution, changes in visibility. Second, even with those explanations, there remain anomalies, places and moments where the evidence doesn't line up neatly, where timelines feel compressed, where technologies appear suddenly, where older knowledge seems to echo forward in ways we can't fully trace. That second truth is where the story gets interesting again. Because sudden appearance is one of the most unsettling patterns in archaeology. When you see a technology or cultural practice emerge without clear precursors, you have to ask, did we just not find the precursors yet? Or did the knowledge arrive from elsewhere? Or did it survive in pockets and then spread rapidly when conditions changed? This is where the concept of refugia becomes critical. In ecology, a refugium is a place where species survive during harsh conditions, valleys, islands, microclimates, then later expand outward when the climate improves. Human knowledge can have refugia too. Certain communities might preserve complex skills through a collapse, not because they're magical, but because their environment insulated them from the worst impacts. An island that remained stable during regional chaos, a mountain valley with reliable water, a coastal zone with constant food supply, a trade hub that never fully shut down, a religious institution that continued teaching even as states fell. If such refugia exist, they can explain why complexity can reappear quickly after a dark period. The knowledge never truly died. It went dormant, localized, hidden, then expanded. And once you accept that idea, the missing age changes from a void into a kind of shadow zone, a phase where the main lights went out but smaller lights remained. Now, here's where you need to be careful, because this is the point where people often jump too far. They look at sudden reappearance and conclude there must have been a secret global civilization, an advanced hidden group, a deliberate suppression. Sometimes those claims outrun the evidence. The responsible move is to hold the uncertainty and ask what mechanisms we already know can produce these patterns. And we do know mechanisms. We know that trade can spread innovations rapidly across surprisingly large distances. We know that elites can sponsor certain technologies, and when elites collapse, those technologies can vanish. We know that oral tradition can preserve complex information in compressed form. We know that small groups can keep craft skills alive. We know that political or religious shifts can rewrite what is remembered. So the mystery isn't that the patterns exist. The mystery is the specific combination. The scale of some collapses, the depth of some silences, and the speed of some recoveries. That's where the missing age remains unsettled, and that's why the best way to continue is to walk through additional case studies, not just the famous ones, but the quieter ones that don't make headlines. Because the missing age isn't a single event like a comet impact or a great flood, it's a recurring shape. So let's move to another place in the library, a shelf labelled "The End of the First Cities," Because long before the Bronze Age, long before palaces and kings, humans built dense settlements in places that don't fit the simple progression story. In multiple regions, you see early complex sites that appear before or alongside agriculture, or at least before the fully matured agricultural states we expect to produce monumental architecture. Some sites show large-scale communal construction, massive stones, complex layouts, ritual spaces, at times when we would expect small, scattered villages. And then, sometimes those sites go quiet. They are intentionally buried, or abandoned, or repurposed. And the reasons are not always clear. What matters here is not any single controversial claim. What matters is the broader pattern. Humans have organized at scale in different ways across time, and those ways can vanish, leaving later people living among ruins they do not fully understand. This is how megaliths become giant work. This is how old roads become natural ridges. This is how a forgotten irrigation system becomes just another line in the earth. And when later people build new systems, they sometimes incorporate the old without understanding it, using ancient stones in new walls, building churches on temples, reusing foundations. Archaeology is full of palimpsests like this, layers of reuse where memory is partial, and partial memory is the beginning of forgetting. So when you're trying to understand missing centuries, you don't only look for destruction. You look for reuse without comprehension. You look for the moment when people stop maintaining something and start scavenging it. That moment is the pivot from continuity to rupture. Because maintenance is memory. If you maintain a road, you remember why it exists. If you maintain an aqueduct, you remember how it works. If you stop maintaining it and start quarrying it, you've crossed into a new world, a world where the old system is dead enough to be material. Now think about what kind of shock could push a society across that line. A shock that breaks institutions. A shock that breaks trust. A shock that makes long-term planning impossible. A shock that makes people focus on survival rather than projects. And this is where we return again to the idea that the missing age might not require a single cataclysm. It might be the cumulative effect of multiple disruptions, a drought plus political conflict, a trade disruption plus epidemic, a volcanic winter plus migration pressure, a resource crisis plus internal fragmentation, because a civilization is not a thing, it's a coordination problem. It's millions of people believing the same system will continue. And when that belief breaks, complexity can collapse faster than anyone expects. That's the part we underestimate. We assume collapse is slow because building was slow, but collapse can be fast because networks are fragile. And once collapse begins, it accelerates. Trade stops, so elites lose luxury goods and legitimacy. Legitimacy breaks, so taxation and labour organisation fails. Labour organisation fails, so infrastructure decays. Infrastructure decays, so food distribution collapses. Food collapses, so conflict increases. Conflict increases, so people migrate. Migration increases, so disease spreads. Disease spreads, so specialists die. Specialists die, so technology degrades. And now in the layers you have a gap, not because nothing happened, but because everything happened at once, a cascade, a cultural landslide. This is the kind of process that produces missing ages without needing secret explanations. And yet, it still leaves you staring at the trench wall, at the sterile layer, wondering what it felt like to live through the moment when the world you knew simply stopped working. Because no one in a collapsing civilization thinks they're entering a missing age. They think they're entering a temporary crisis. They think the system will come back. They think the rains will return. They think the trade ships will arrive. They think the king will restore order. They think the gods will listen again. Then 1 year becomes 5, 5 becomes 20. Children grow up never having seen the old world, and suddenly what was a crisis becomes normal, a new baseline, and from that point forward, the old world is not remembered as reality. It's remembered as legend. This is how missing centuries are born, not out of emptiness, but out of generational turnover. And if you want one of the most chilling measures of that turnover, it's something archaeologists sometimes find in the simplest objects, weights and measures, and complex trade societies often use standardized weights. They have consistent units, they have systems. When those systems collapse, the weights become inconsistent or disappear entirely. And when a new system rises, it often creates new standards, sometimes echoing the old, sometimes completely different. So a missing age can be visible as a break in measurement, a break in how people quantify the world. And quantification is as cultural as language. Lose it, and you lose a certain kind of complexity. Now, there's another clue that cuts even deeper than pottery or weights. It's in the bones. Because human skeletons preserve information that writing sometimes doesn't. Isotopes in teeth can reveal where a person grew up. Isotopes in bone can reveal what they ate. Stress markers can reveal famine. Trauma can reveal violence. Disease patterns can reveal crowding. So when an archaeologist studies a collapse, they can ask, did people migrate? Did diets change? Did childhood stress increase? Did violence rise? Did population density drop? And sometimes the answers line up perfectly with the missing layer. You see more mobility, more people born elsewhere. You see diets shifting from diverse to narrow. You see signs of malnutrition. You see more trauma. You see lower life expectancy. These are biological signatures of a missing age, and they matter because they pull the mystery back into the human scale. The missing age isn't only a missing record, it's a lived experience of stress, movement, and adaptation. And that's where the next part of this story leads, into the precise ways archaeologists try to reconstruct those lived experiences when the pages of the historical record go blank. Because the truth is, even in the silence, the earth is never completely quiet. It whispers. And if you know what to listen for, those whispers become a story that keeps going, even when the official narrative runs out. And that whispering begins with the simplest thing an archaeologist can do in a blank phase. They stop looking for palaces. They stop looking for inscriptions. They stop looking for the kinds of artifacts that only exist when a complex elite economy is humming. Instead, they start looking for the smallest signs of ordinary life, a scatter of tiny burned seeds, a thin lens of ash no larger than a dinner plate, a single post hole dark against lighter soil, where a wooden stake once stood, a few flakes of stone from tool repair, a cluster of animal bones that were broken in a very specific way, split to extract marrow, which usually means stress, scarcity, or a strategy designed for maximum calories. When the big lights go out, this is what remains. And the first thing you learn when you train yourself to see these small traces is that missing rarely means empty. It means quieter. It means more mobile. It means dispersed. It means people living in ways that don't leave monumental debris. Think of the difference between a stadium after a concert and a forest after a campfire. The stadium leaves concrete and metal. The forest leaves a circle of charcoal and a few burnt stones. Both contained people, but only one looks obvious after 1,000 years. So if you want to understand the missing age, you have to understand the archaeology of low visibility life. And low visibility life is often the default state of human existence. Most humans who have ever lived did not live in cities. Most humans who have ever lived did not write. Most humans who have ever lived did not build in stone. They lived in wood, reed, hide, and earth. They moved, they adapted. They left traces that can be erased by a flood, by ploughing, by roots, by burrowing animals, by a few centuries of rain and freeze-thaw cycles. So sometimes a gap is not a gap in human presence. It's a gap in our ability to detect the kind of presence we're used to seeing. That's the first uncomfortable truth. The second uncomfortable truth is that sometimes the gap is real. Sometimes there really is a sharp population drop. Sometimes the landscape really does empty. Sometimes the number of fires, the density of refuse, the thickness of occupation layers really does collapse. And when that happens, you have to ask what kind of pressure can push entire regions into abandonment. This is where the Earth itself enters the story, not as a vague force, but as a set of mechanisms. Drought is one, but drought isn't just no rain. Drought is the collapse of reliability. A society can handle a bad year. It can even handle several. But when rainfall patterns shift enough that farmers can't predict planting seasons, when rivers change course, when groundwater drops, when reservoirs run dry, the entire logic of settlement breaks. And the archaeological signature of that kind of stress is often subtle. You might see more storage pits as people try to buffer against uncertainty. You might see changes in crop choices, more drought-tolerant grains, fewer water-hungry plants. You might see more animal herding relative to farming. You might see more evidence of conflict as competition for water intensifies. And then, at some point, you see the ultimate signature. People leave. They don't always leave in panic. They leave gradually, family by family, as the future becomes impossible to plan. And in the layers, that looks like a fading. Fewer repairs, fewer rebuilds, fewer new construction phases, less trash, less charcoal, less everything, until the last hearth goes cold. Now imagine you're living inside that slow fade. You don't see it as collapse. You see it as compromise. You plant less. You store more. You argue more. You travel farther for water. You hear rumours that the upstream villages are fighting. You hear rumours that caravans are being raided. You notice that the market is thinner. Fewer traders, less tin, less luxury, less news from far away. And then one season someone says it out loud. We can't stay. And that sentence changes history. Because once a critical mass of people stops believing in the settlement becomes fragile. A city is not only walls, a city is labour, maintenance, sanitation, security, governance, food distribution. If the people who do those things start leaving, the city fails faster. Not because someone attacked it, but because coordination broke. So a missing age can be born from the moment coordination becomes too expensive. But drought is only one stress. There's another that can carve blank pages into history with terrifying efficiency. Epidemic. We think of epidemics as medieval plagues, Black Death, documented disasters. But epidemics have been part of human history as long as humans have had density. And we have more evidence for ancient disease than we used to. Skeletons can show signs of certain infections. DNA can sometimes be extracted from teeth and bones, revealing pathogens. Mass graves can reveal sudden mortality spikes. But even without direct pathogen evidence, you can infer disease indirectly. A sudden abandonment without burning, a collapse of urban sanitation systems, a dramatic change in burial practices, a demographic skew in who died. And the most important part is this. Epidemics can break knowledge chains. If a society loses a high percentage of adults in a single generation, especially specialists, the transmission of skills collapses, the children survive. But who teaches them? Who teaches metallurgy? Who teaches writing? Who teaches the rituals, the calendars, the building methods? This is how an epidemic can create a missing age that looks like cultural amnesia, because it's not that humans decided to forget, it's that the teachers died, and when the teachers die, the school ends. The next generation grows up in a world where the old knowledge is rumour, legend, a story about what people used to do, and stories are not blueprints. This is one of the most brutal truths of cultural evolution. You can preserve meaning without preserving method. You can remember that something existed without remembering how to make it. You can remember that ancestors built great things without knowing how they did it. That's how you get later peoples living among ruins, telling stories about giants, not because they're irrational, but because the skill chain broke so completely that the ruins become alien. And if you want to see how quickly that can happen, you don't even need ancient examples. You can watch it in small scale today. Lose a craft tradition, lose a language, lose a technique. It can vanish in one generation. Now scale that up. Scale that up across a region, across an entire networked civilization. The result is a missing age that is not an empty space, but a space filled with survivors who can no longer reproduce the world that collapsed. And that is when the archaeological record simplifies, because the complexity was never just tools, it was systems. Now there's another kind of stress that creates gaps in a different way: war. But war doesn't always look like what people imagine. We imagine siege, flames, burn layers, skeletons in the streets. Sometimes you get that, but often systemic warfare looks like insecurity, and insecurity kills trade before it kills cities. If caravans can't move safely, long-distance exchange collapses. If exchange collapses, elites lose materials and legitimacy. If legitimacy collapses, the state fragments, and fragmentation changes everything, because fragmentation creates many small centers instead of one big center, and many small centers leave a different kind of record, less standardized, less monumental, harder to date, harder to connect. This is one reason certain post-collapse periods feel missing. The map breaks into pieces, and archaeology is always easier when you're reading a centralized script. When the script fractures, the pages scatter. Now, if you take drought, epidemic, war, and systemic fragility, you already have a powerful toolkit for explaining many missing phases. But the mystery of the missing age isn't satisfied by explanation alone, because the mind still asks, why do the gaps feel synchronized? Why do different regions show collapse-like signatures around similar broad windows? Why do myths across cultures speak of darkness and rebuilding? Why do so many systems seem to crest, then shatter? To answer that, you have to think bigger than individual civilizations. You have to think in terms of climate regimes, because human history doesn't unfold on a stable planet. It unfolds on a planet that swings. Monsoons shift, ocean currents change, volcanoes erupt, solar output varies. And the most important detail is that climate change is not always gradual. Sometimes it snaps, sometimes it crosses thresholds. A region can shift from reliable rainfall to unpredictable drought within a century. An ocean current can weaken, shifting temperature and rainfall patterns across continents. A series of volcanic eruptions can inject aerosols into the atmosphere, cooling the planet, disrupting agriculture, shortening growing seasons. These are not hypothetical, these are mechanisms we observe. And when these mechanisms align with societies already near fragility thresholds, the result can be widespread collapse. This is how you get the feeling of global missing chapters, not because a single event erased humanity, but because multiple societies, optimized for stable conditions, encountered instability at once, and instability is a civilizational predator. It hunts complex systems because complex systems depend on predictability. A farmer can survive unpredictability, but a state that taxes farmers to feed cities struggles. A household can adjust, but a trade network built on scheduled exchanges can collapse. A village can relocate, but a monumental building program cannot. So when climate regimes shift, the most complex, most centralized systems are often the most vulnerable, and when they collapse, the world looks like it went backwards, because the visible markers of complexity vanish. Now, at this point in the story, it's tempting to imagine missing ages as vast, singular dark periods, like someone turned off the lights on civilization and then turned them back on later. But the reality is often more uneven. Some places collapse while others persist. Some regions shrink while others become refugeia. Some knowledge disappears while other knowledge survives. So instead of one dark age, you get a patchwork, a mosaic of decline and continuity. And this mosaic is where archaeologists do their most delicate work, because the answer is rarely dramatic. It's often about shifts in settlement patterns, shifts in diet, shifts in mobility, shifts in social organization. So let's walk into another missing shelf in the library. A shelf labeled After the Empire, because empires are the most visible forms of civilization, and their collapse creates some of the most famous gaps. Rome, for example, leaves a visible scar across Europe. Roads, aqueducts, concrete, coins, writing. And then, after the Western Empire fractures, those systems diminish. But here's what's fascinating. The knowledge didn't vanish uniformly. In some places, road maintenance continued. In some places, literate institutions persisted. In some places, specialized crafts survived. The decline wasn't identical everywhere. It depended on local continuity, on whether a city remained inhabited, on whether an elite class remained stable, on whether the church or other institutions preserved literacy. So the darkness wasn't a simple blackout. It was uneven power loss. And if you understand that, you can understand many earlier missing periods too. Because what looks like a gap at a major urban site might correspond to continuity in the countryside, or continuity in a different region, or continuity in a different form. This is why the concept of center and periphery is so important. When a center collapses, the periphery can sometimes thrive. It can become the new center. A trade route shifts. A new power rises. A formerly marginal region becomes crucial. So in the archaeological record, you might see one city vanish while another grows, and if you're only looking at the old center, you perceive a missing age. But the story might have moved. It might have relocated. History has a habit of changing venues. Now what about those moments when the story seems to vanish everywhere? When population drops appear broad, when settlement density collapses across a region, when writing disappears, when long-distance trade stops. Those moments are real, and they are the core of this mystery. So the next step is to ask, how do we measure population in the deep past? Because we can't count people directly. We infer, we estimate, and those inferences can shape the illusion of gaps. One classic proxy is site counts. More sites often means more people, but site counts can be biased by visibility and research intensity. Some regions have been surveyed thoroughly, others barely. Some site types are easy to spot, others hide. So archaeologists use multiple proxies. They look at the distribution of radiocarbon dates. If many radiocarbon dates cluster in a period, it suggests high activity. If few dates exist, it suggests lower activity. But that can also reflect sampling bias. So they use still more. They look at pollen cores to infer agriculture intensity. More cereal pollen, more farming, less cereal pollen, less farming. They look at charcoal in sediment cores to infer burning and land management. They look at isotope data in bones to infer diet changes. They look at the scale of construction projects. They look at the number of burials. They look at the density of artifacts per layer. And when multiple proxies line up, when site counts drop, cereal pollen drops, charcoal drops, burials drop, you start to see a real population contraction. That is when missing becomes meaningful. That is when you are looking at a true demographic event. And demographic events have consequences. Because when population contracts, networks break. When networks break, complexity declines. When complexity declines, the record simplifies, and now you have a missing age that is both real and visible. But the mystery remains. Why do these contractions happen? Sometimes we can see causes, sometimes we can't, and when we can't, we're left with an eerie negative space, a signature without a clear fingerprint. That negative space is where the mind starts to generate stories. And this is where you, as a storyteller, have to balance tension with restraint. You can say, we don't know. You can say, there are competing hypotheses. You can say, the evidence suggests stress, instability, and fragmentation. You can also say, the gaps are deep enough that they provoke the imagination. Because the imagination is part of the human response to missing chapters. But if you want to keep the style grounded, you always return to what the Earth actually shows. So let's do that. Let's return to the trench wall. Picture the profile again. At the bottom, the last phase of the old world, you can see the floor. You can see a collapsed wall. You can see pottery smashed where it fell. You can see carbonized grains from a storage jar. That jar matters, because carbonized grains can be radiocarbon dated, and those grains can tell you what crops people relied on: wheat, barley, millet, rice. And when you date them, you get a point in time, the last moment that jar existed as a functioning object. Then, above it, you see a thin layer of windblown dust, and then another, and another, and then the soil changes. Maybe a root horizon forms, a long period of stability where plants grew and no one disturbed the ground. That root horizon is the quiet signature of abandonment. It's a missing age written in roots. Now above that, the first signs of return: a small hearth, a few rough pots, a post hole, a new kind of building, and if you're careful, you can see how that return differs from the old world. The pottery is different, the diet is different, the architecture is different, the settlement layout is different, the people might even be different, and this is where the missing age becomes not only about absence but about transition. 'Cause who returns? Is it the descendants of the people who left? Is it a different group migrating in? Is it a mixture? This is where genetics and isotopes become powerful. If you find burials from before and after, you can compare. You can look at genetic continuity. You can look at isotopic signatures indicating childhood location. You can see whether the post-gap population grew up locally or arrived from elsewhere. And sometimes the answer is startling. Sometimes the post-gap population is genetically distinct. Sometimes it's continuous, sometimes it's mixed, which means the missing age can sometimes be a migration story, a relocation story, a demographic reshaping, and migration is one of the most underappreciated forces in history. We tend to imagine ancient populations as static, but they moved. They moved when climate shifted. They moved when conflict rose. They moved when trade collapsed. They moved when new opportunities appeared, and migration can produce missing chapters because it relocates people away from the sites we know. It moves history into new places, new layers, new landscapes, and if those new landscapes are less visible archaeologically, mountains, forests, wetlands, the story becomes harder to find. So a missing age can be a story of movement into invisibility. Now, if you want a concrete example of invisibility, consider how much of human history happened along coasts. Coasts are rich. They provide fish, shellfish, seaweed, birds, salt, trade routes. They are natural highways. Humans have lived along coasts for tens of thousands of years, and yet, when sea levels rose after the last ice age, many ancient coastal settlements were submerged, entire landscapes drowned. Vast stretches of coastline that were inhabited became seabed, which means a huge portion of early human settlement archaeology is underwater. So some missing chapters might not be missing in time, they might be missing in space, they might be sitting beneath the sea. And when you realize that, the library metaphor becomes even more literal. Because imagine a library where entire shelves fell into the ocean. You could still write a history of the books that remain, but you would always have gaps. And those gaps would not necessarily correspond to real cultural absences, they would correspond to preservation bias. This is why archaeologists talk about taphonomy, the processes that determine what survives, because the record is not neutral. It is filtered by geology, climate, later human activity, and chance. So any missing age has to be evaluated with that in mind. Is it a real gap or a preservation gap? Is it an absence of humans or an absence of what survives? Now, your script has leaned into the idea that some missing chapters might be deliberately erased or suppressed. If you want to keep that tension but make it less sweeping, you can ground it in something real and common in archaeology: selective excavation and selective publication. Not a global conspiracy, just the mundane reality that not everything gets studied, not everything gets published, not everything gets preserved. Archaeology is expensive. Excavation destroys sites as you dig, so most sites are only partially excavated. Most artifacts go into storage. Most data sits in grey literature, unpublished reports produced for compliance archaeology. And sometimes, unusual finds don't get immediate attention simply because they don't fit the research priorities of the moment. That kind of institutional forgetting is not secretive, it's structural, it's bureaucracy, it's limited budgets, it's career incentives. So you can talk about how anomalies can be sidelined without implying a hidden hand. Because the effect can look similar, certain stories get told, others fade, and that's a real human mechanism of forgetting. Now let's return to the core emotional hook of your piece. The idea that history has blank pages, the idea that we live among ruins of worlds we don't fully remember, the idea that, after collapse, people can forget not only techniques but the very existence of the old world. If you want to deepen that without drifting, you lean into the psychology of generational memory. Most humans' lived memory extends maybe 3 generations. You remember your grandparents. You might hear stories of their grandparents. Beyond that, it becomes fog. Names fade. Events blur. Even in literate societies, memory decays quickly without active maintenance. Now imagine a society without writing, where record-keeping is oral, and where a collapse breaks social continuity. In that context, forgetting can be fast, not because humans are weak, because time is relentless. And children grow up inside whatever world exists. If the old world is gone, they don't experience it. They can't anchor it. So it becomes myth. And myth is how civilizations remember what they can't reconstruct. This is why myths of golden ages are so common. They are psychological fossils. They are the imprint of a remembered complexity that no longer exists. And those myths often have the same structure. There was a time when things were better, then a catastrophe, then darkness, then rebuilding, that structure can emerge naturally from collapse. Because collapse feels like an end of the world to the people inside it, and rebuilding feels like a new beginning. So when you see the same mythic structure across cultures, it doesn't necessarily mean a single global event. It can mean a shared human experience, the experience of systems breaking, and that shared experience is what makes the missing age phenomenon feel universal. Because it is universal. Civilizations are fragile, memory is fragile, knowledge is fragile, and the archaeological record is fragile. So now, as the listener drifts deeper into sleep, you can guide them through one more doorway in the library, a section labelled The Technologies That Vanish. Because one of the most haunting aspects of missing chapters is not simply the loss of cities, but the disappearance of specific capabilities. Concrete in Rome, writing in post-palatial Greece, certain metallurgical techniques, certain architectural traditions, certain navigational systems, certain agricultural methods. It's not just that societies became simpler, it's that they became simpler in specific ways, and those specifics point to what was held by specialists. For example, complex metallurgy depends on supply chains. Tin is rare, copper is more common, bronze requires both. If trade routes fail, tin becomes scarce. If tin becomes scarce, bronze production declines. If bronze declines, tool and weapon quality changes. If tool quality changes, agricultural efficiency changes. If agricultural efficiency changes, food surplus declines. And surplus is what funds specialists. So the loss of bronze is not just metal becomes rare, it can be a cascade, and cascades are the shape of missing ages. Now consider writing again. Writing is not only a tool, it's a network. A script must be learned. A bureaucracy must demand it. A society must value records. If palaces collapse, the scribal class can vanish. And once scribes vanish, you can lose not only writing, but administrative memory, land boundaries, debts, treaties, calendars, tax records. That loss can make it harder for a new centralized state to form. So the post-collapse period becomes more local, more oral, more flexible, more fragmented. And fragmentation is often the archaeological definition of missing. Because fragmentation doesn't produce one narrative, it produces many small ones. So in the library metaphor, it's not that the books are gone, it's that the books are scattered into hundreds of small pamphlets, and no one collected them. Now, if you want to push deeper, you can explore the idea that human history contains compression zones, periods that look longer or shorter depending on how you measure them. Some periods are richly documented, dense layers, abundant artifacts, inscriptions, dates. Other periods are thin, few sites, few dates, sparse layers. When you reconstruct timelines, the dense periods feel expansive and detailed. The thin periods feel like voids. But the thin periods can still contain centuries of human life. They just don't leave the same thickness of evidence. So a missing age can be a compression illusion, time passing without leaving much, and that concept can be surprisingly soothing in a strange way, because it reframes the blank, not as nothingness, but as quiet human time. People still waking up, still making meals, still raising children, still telling stories by firelight, even if they weren't building palaces, even if they weren't writing, even if they weren't trading across seas, they were alive. And in that sense, the missing age is not only a mystery, it's a reminder of how much human experience never enters the official record. Most of history is unrecorded. Most lives are invisible. And yet, those invisible lives are the real continuity. They are the thread that survives collapse. So the missing age becomes a question of perspective. From the viewpoint of kings and cities, it's darkness. From the viewpoint of ordinary families, it might be simply a different rhythm, harder, smaller, more local, but still a life, still a human world. Now we can take this insight and return to the listener's mind gently, the way your style does, drawing them into the feeling that they are peering into a deep ancient silence and finding movement inside it. Because the most unsettling thing about missing chapters is not that we don't know what happened, it's that we can almost see it, like shapes behind fog, the outline of a system breaking, the outline of people adapting, the outline of memory fading, the outline of new identities forming. And once you start seeing those outlines, you start noticing how often they recur. You start noticing that civilization is not a permanent state. It's a phase, a pattern, a wave, and waves rise and fall. Now the next step in this story is to zoom in on one specific kind of evidence that feels like a message from the missing age itself, a kind of artifact that appears in transitional layers across many regions. Horde deposits. 'Cause hoards are fear-made material. A hoard is a stash of valuables buried with the intention of retrieving them later. Coins, jewellery, tools, weapons, ingots, sometimes ritual objects, sometimes household wealth. And what makes hoards so haunting is that many were never retrieved, which means the person who buried them did not come back. They died, or fled, or the social world changed so much that they could not return. So hoards are like frozen moments of crisis, and they often cluster around collapse horizons. They appear before and during missing ages. They spike when people lose trust in institutions. Because when you trust your society, you don't bury your wealth. You store it in houses, you invest it, you display it, you circulate it. But when you feel the ground shifting under your feet, when you fear invasion, famine, political chaos, you bury what you can, hoping you'll return. So an increase in hoards can signal a society entering instability, and hoards can be dated. They can be tied to coin sequences, they can be tied to artifact typologies, they can be radiocarbon dated if organic materials are present. So hoards become timestamps of fear, and when you line them up across a region, you can see the approach of a missing age like a storm front. Now imagine the human experience behind those hoards. A person kneeling in the dirt at night, digging quickly, looking over their shoulder. Maybe they wrapped their valuables in cloth. Maybe they placed them in a pottery jar. Maybe they marked the spot in their mind, 3 steps from the stone, beneath the old tree. And as they buried it, they believed they would come back. They are making a promise to the future, a promise that the world would stabilize, that life would return to normal. But the missing age is what happens when that promise breaks, when normal never comes back. And the hoard stays underground until someone finds it thousands of years later. A message from a person who lived in the moment the lights began to go out. This is the kind of detail that keeps the story grounded, because it connects the abstract idea of missing centuries to something you can picture. A hand, a jar, a hurried burial, a life interrupted. Now, there's another transitional signature that is even quieter, the reuse of old materials. In post-collapse periods, people often scavenge the ruins. They take stones from temples to build small walls. They take bronze from broken statues to make tools. They melt down old objects. They repurpose. And in that repurposing, you see a shift in relationship to the past. The ruins become quarries. The past becomes resource. That shift is a kind of forgetting. Because when you quarry an old monument, you're no longer preserving it as meaning. You're treating it as stone. And that tells you something about the continuity of memory. It's been broken. Now, as you continue deeper into this library, the missing shelves begin to feel less like voids and more like transition corridors, places where the story narrows, where it becomes intimate, where it becomes about survival and adaptation rather than kings and temples, and you realize that what we call missing is often the most human part of history, because it is the part where people face the collapse of certainty, and humans are defined by what they do when certainty collapses. They move, they regroup, they form new alliances, they tell new stories, they invent new identities, they rebuild. But they rebuild with fragments, and those fragments are what archaeologists chase. A motif that persists in pottery decoration, a tool form that continues, a burial practice that echoes, a word root preserved in languages, a genetic lineage that continues through a bottleneck. These fragments are the true pages that survive, and they are everywhere if you know how to read them. So now, the question isn't simply, what caused the missing ages? The question becomes, how do we reconstruct a story from fragments? How do we move from sterile layers and simplified pottery to human narrative? How do we tell the story of a world that forgot itself? And that is where this exploration becomes not only about archaeology, but about the nature of history itself. Because history is not the past. History is what survives, and what survives is biased towards stone and fire and wealth and writing, which means the quieter the era, the more missing it feels. So as you drift, you can hold this paradox in your mind. A missing age can be a catastrophe, or it can be an illusion produced by the quietness of ordinary life, or it can be both at once. A real population contraction that also changes visibility. A real collapse that also disperses people into places we don't easily find. A real loss of institutions that also erases the kinds of artifacts historians love. And once you accept that, the missing age stops being a single mystery. It becomes a recurring condition of human societies, a shadow that follows complexity, a reminder that what we build can vanish, and what we remember can vanish even faster. Now, somewhere deeper in this library, there is one more shelf that always feels haunted. It's the shelf labelled with the simplest word, before the last collapse, before the last rebuilding, before writing, before cities, before the first civilization in the textbooks. Because if missing ages happen in recorded history, they can also happen in prehistory. And if prehistory is already thin, then a missing age inside prehistory becomes almost impossible to see. A shadow inside a shadow. And that is where the biggest blank pages may hide. Not in the Bronze Age, not in Rome, but in the deep past, where the only record is stone and bone and earth, where even 1,000-year cultural phase can vanish without leaving clear fingerprints, where an entire network could rise and fall without ever being recognized as a civilization by later observers, because if it didn't build in stone, it might not survive. If it built in wood, it might be gone. If it lived along coasts now underwater, it might be lost. If it left its knowledge in oral tradition that later broke, it might be erased. So the missing age, at its deepest, isn't only about civilizations we know, it's about the civilizations we don't know we lost. And that idea, more than anything, is what makes the library feel unsettling. Because it suggests that the biggest gaps might not be the ones we've named. They might be the ones we can't even see yet. There might be the books that fell behind the shelves, or sank beneath the floor, or burned without leaving ash. And somewhere, under soil, under forests, under water, under time, the evidence is still there, waiting for the right method, the right question, the right moment of attention, waiting to turn another blank page into a story.